Hi, my name is Chris Martell. I'm from Boston University, and I'm this year's current Social Studies Research SIG chair. And first, I'd like to welcome all of you. Thank you for coming to our business meeting. Give yourselves a round of applause. Starting great out with a round of applause. So, we have a vibrant SIG. It's a space for social studies education here at AERA, and we're just really excited you're here. We're going to start with our keynote speaker. And then after the speaker, we'll proceed to the business meeting. And then after the business meeting, we'll soon be giving you information. We have a great reception that we hope all of you consider coming to. And I've heard we have drink tickets, which may encourage you to get there for sure. So, all right, so I'm going to give us a start here. So I'd like to introduce our guest speaker. Joel Westheimer is the University Research Chair in Democracy and Education at the University of Ottawa. He is also an education columnist for the CBC Radio's Ottawa Morning and Ontario Today. He began his career teaching in the New York City public school system before obtaining a PhD from Stanford University. Westheimer's award-winning books include Pledging Allegiance, The Politics of Patriotism in America's Schools, with a foreword by the late Howard Zinn, and Among School Teachers, Community, Autonomy, and Ideology in Teachers' Work. His newest critically acclaimed book is What Kind of Citizen? Educating Our Children for the Common Good. Westheimer lectures widely and has delivered more than 200 keynote speeches at conferences, public events, and universities. He frequently addresses radio and television audiences nationally and internationally on shows such as Good Morning America, More to Life, The Agenda, NBC TV News, NBC, CBC, and C-SPAN. In 2015, he was designated laureate of Kappa Delta Pi, the International Education Honor Society established in 1911. Westheimer is also a recipient of the Canadian Education Association's Whitworth Award and a Knight Fellow for Civic Engagement in Higher Education. He lives in Ottawa with his wife and 2 children, and in the winter, he ice skates to and from work. Without further ado, Joel.
I'm a low-tech presenter. Wow, Chris, thank you. That was like, I wish my mother was here to hear that. That was really nice. Thanks for coming here during your dinner time. It's super nice to be here and to get the chance to be able to share these ideas with you. And I'm hoping we're going to have a good discussion as well, because this, I don't think we could have a much more important and urgent kind of discussion than the ones that are represented by some of the things I'm going to talk about, also represented in a lot of the work that people in this room do. So I'm really happy about that. I thought I would start, though, even though Chris and Jane Lowe and others who invited me didn't ask me to do this. You know, I'm from New York originally, and I've been living here for 15 years. And since AERA is taking place in Canada, I thought I would help some of you understand a little bit about Canada for those who are American. How many Americans are there here? And how many Canadians? Okay, so the real Canadians can help me out because I'm not a real Canadian. But the first thing I'll tell you is that the very use of the word American might be offensive to some Canadians, right? Yes. Because we're all Americans, right? The problem, of course, is that it's hard to refer to Americans as United Statesans or something. There's really just no good way to say it, and so we all kind of default to Americans anyway. But Canadians often ask me, you know, what Americans think of Canada, what they think about Canada, and the answer, of course, is Americans don't think about Canada. Now that changed a bit now because every American I know wants to move to Canada, and we now have in our guest room a stack of asylum forms that people can fill out if they want to try and stay. But I like telling you, Chris mentioned that I ice skate to and from work, which is true during the winter months when the canal is open. I live in Ottawa. Ottawa has a canal called the Rideau Canal. It's supposedly the largest ice skating rink in the world. I don't really know how that could be because we're competing against Norway and I don't know, all the Scandinavian countries. But anyway, I really do. We live in the middle of the canal, walking distance. My wife teaches at Carleton University, which is on one end of the canal. I teach at University of Ottawa, which is on the other end of the canal. So this doesn't really happen, but theoretically we could walk hand in hand down to the canal and wave goodbye and part ways, and we would both skate off to work, so it's very romantic. But I like telling my US friends that I skate to work because I feel like I'm doing my part in upholding all the Canadian stereotypes that are possible. And for those of you who've been to Ottawa and been on the canal, you'll know that I sometimes eat beaver tails on the canal, which are actually fried pastry doughs. But if I leave that part out, it's I get up from my igloo in the morning and go onto the canal and skate to work. But actually, I should let me say one other thing. When I first moved here, my last class that I taught at NYU, my students, unbeknownst to me, got together. There was a Canadian in the class, and she knew that Ottawa had this canal. And my students got together, and on the last class of the last day that I was at NYU, the class presented me with ice skates, which was so nice, right? And they were the perfect ice skates for the canal. It was like perfect. And so once I was teaching, in my first year that I got here, and I said that these ice skates that my students gave me, which was so nice, it just helped me adjust right to Ottawa. And I saw all the students looking at me, and I thought like something is really wrong. And I said, what? And one student raised his hand and said, Professor Westheimer, it's not ice skates, it's skates. And I said, well, it's skating, right? It's not ice skating, it's skating. I said, what about, ice hockey? And they said, no, it's hockey, right? And I said, what about field hockey and, floor hockey? I said, that's field hockey, that's floor hockey. So, anyway, so I got used to that. Probably you've already seen from sessions you've been to that here in Canada, it's grade 3, not 3rd grade. Grade 10, not 10th grade. You've maybe figured out that the university years are not freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, the high school years too, but rather first year, second year, third year, fourth year. Although inexplicably, maybe the Canadians can explain this to me, Canadians do have something called Frosh Week, which clearly comes from the word freshman, but they don't use the word freshman, so anyway, that comes there. And then, the last thing I'll tell you is that Canadian Thanksgiving is celebrated in October, not November. And you might ask, well, is it about like the Pilgrims, or what exactly are Canadians celebrating for Canadian Thanksgiving? And the answer is, I don't know, so ask the real Canadians there. A couple of other differences in the per capita spending for healthcare in Canada is, this is in US dollars, is about $3,600 per capita, and in the US, the per capita spending on healthcare is about $7,200. Despite that difference, we spend about half as much as Americans on healthcare. Despite that difference, life expectancy in Canada is about 3 years longer than in the US, 80 versus 77. Infant mortality is 4 deaths per 1,000 live births. Oh my goodness. And in the US, it's 6 deaths per 1,000 live births. And the last thing I'll tell you, and then I'll stop talking about Canada, is that schools here, you're going to find this shocking, but schools are not actually funded by real estate taxes or local municipal taxes. They are funded provincially. Almost all the funding comes provincially, which means, this is crazy, I know, that schools in a province generally get equitable funding across the way, not like the disastrous mess we have in the US. Now that, of course, does not mean things are perfect in Canada. Schools are still schooling is inequitably distributed in all kinds of ways, not the least of which is the parent funds that get raised. My kids' school used to raise, with this one event, a book sale, they would raise $27,000 or so a year, $30,000 a year a school across town, of course, in a poorer neighborhood, would raise $1,000 or $500. So there's lots of inequities left to. It's no utopia, but it is much more equitable than in the U.S. So I just want to say one other thing. My colleague Sharon Cook wrote a piece on patriotism in the Canadian version. She called it Patriotism, the Canadian version. And in that chapter, I love this thing that she cited. She said, who do Canadians cite as the most famous Canadian? Well, there was this contest across Canada for the most famous Canadian. And they asked however many thousands of people who not the most famous, the most important Canadian, right? And many people figured that, well, it would be Wayne Gretzky, or who would win? Maybe Pierre Trudeau, the beloved statesman. Would it be Jim Carrey, or William Shatner, or Neil Young, or Justin Bieber? They're all Canadian. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And no, actually, the person who won was Tommy Douglas. And Tommy Douglas was best known, well, some people know him for being Kiefer Sutherland's granddad, but he's best known for basically instituting the first universal Medicare program in the West, which set the stage for Canada's form of healthcare system. So the fact that the general public held him up as the hero of Canada tells you something about the kind of importance that things like public institutions have here in Canada. Now, before all the Canadians in the audience berate me for waxing so poetic about Canada, there's lots of problems here. Canada interned Japanese Canadians. They slaughtered many Chinese people building railroads. Of course, the Aboriginal residential schools were awful. But there are some important differences that I think are interesting given the topic that we're going to talk about today. So thanks for bearing with me for that little lesson in Canadiana. My title's a little misleading because Chris and I and Jane went back and forth a little bit. The theme for AERA this year is leveraging educational research in a post-truth era. I don't like the term post-truth because of the way it reifies the notion of truth in the first place. But that aside, I titled this talk, Teaching Democratic Citizenship in the Era of Misinformation. Now, we're living in times when Daniel Patrick Moynihan's quip that everyone is entitled to their own opinion but not to their own facts seems almost quaint, right? Opinion is now not only mistaken for fact, but the United States has a president who either exhaustively peddles nonsense opinions as facts, but actually, or maybe sufficiently mentally ill that he himself does not know there is a difference between the two. There's been a lot of terrific work recently on misinformation. Joe Kahn, Avner Segal, Jeremy Stoddard, Ellen Middaugh, Erica Hodgin, Wayne Journell, and many others. In fact, Wayne Journell just had a volume that came out called Unpacking Fake News, and it contains an edited volume, and it contains some terrific work on this topic. And really, when you think about it, 2 years ago, Kellyanne Conway perhaps gave us the most succinct defense of fake news possible when she told, you remember this, right, Meet the Press's Chuck Todd, that Sean Spicer was using alternative facts when reporting the number of people attending the presidential inauguration. And Todd maybe gave the most succinct rejoinder to that, where he said, look, alternative facts are not facts, they're falsehoods, right? Now, we of course need continued research on how to best address misinformation in social studies classrooms and civic education programs, and I know a lot of people in this room and elsewhere are doing that kind of work. So I don't want to cover the same territory. So what I'm more interested in for this talk might accurately be called misdirection than misinformation, based on the simple fact that we not only live in times of great distraction and short attention spans, but also of a seemingly bottomless willingness of powerful government officials to lead our attention away from things that matter and towards things that don't. David Greenberg had a recent piece in the New York Times, some of you may have seen it, where he talks about the journalistic feeding frenzy. He was talking about the recent scandals with Joe Biden touching people's shoulders inappropriately. And David Greenberg is a Rutgers historian and a journalism professor, and he describes the 1980s and 1990s feeding frenzies. He talks about Gary Hart and Donna Rice, the spectacle of that, the endless stories about who may or may not have smoked marijuana, which is legal in all of Canada. And then there was Dan Quayle's draft avoidance thing. I actually thought the scandal with Dan Quayle was that he couldn't spell avoidance, but I do remember the whole draft avoidance thing. And Greenberg calls these feeding frenzies, and this is a quote from him, a kind of giddy journalistic derangement over politicians' adultery, drug use, and draft avoidance. Greenberg says that this period subsided as Bill Clinton was elected president, even though we knew he was an admitted philanderer, and Barack Obama, you may recall, confessed to having used a little blow in his youth. And so he said that we enjoyed a period where those kinds of things didn't enter politics so readily, and there was some ability, at least, to focus on things that mattered. But his description of the media is, I think, indicative of a problem educators have when it comes to not only misinformation spread by political parties and suspect grassroots organizations, but also to misdirection by the media. He says this: charges about inappropriate touching must be heard and evaluated, referring to Biden, right? But the more difficult question for journalists is whether these charges should become grounds for feeding frenzies, all-consuming, multi-day stories that by virtue of their blanket coverage signal to audiences that they outweigh everything else about a candidate. And this, of course, we all know is because journalists and educators have kind of perverse incentives, journalists in particular I'm talking about first, have perverse incentives because what they want is our attention, right? And our attention is gotten by calling everything a scandal. But they're at odds, of course, with what might be best for educating people about democratic citizenship and about the kind of participation on important matters. So my question is, what can social studies educators do to counteract not only misinformation, but misdirection? This endless distraction project that is a product of a trifecta of social ills that we're experiencing. The first is unchecked capitalism that rewards a small number of people for distracting the rest of us. Right? That's the media, but also, of course, the titans of technology and many other institutions, areas of our society. The second is technological advances that make these efforts more and more effective. Right? We're all distracted by these little computers we carry around in our pockets. And then the third, of course, is a kind of politics that thrives on a misdirected public, and we're experiencing that now across the world to a degree that we haven't seen since the 1930s. Greenberg also points out that it is possible to cover stories such as these without creating these feeding frenzies. Right? Journalists can run fewer stories on a subject, talk about it once a day on cable news and not every hour, assume a matter-of-fact tone, remind themselves that Twitter isn't public opinion, question scandal material shopped by someone's political rivals, and so on, right? But these are things that journalists are not doing, which means it falls on all of us, educators, to teach young people how to not only detect fake news and wrong information, but how to detect misdirection, right? How to learn how to focus in on the things that matter. So with that preamble, I'm just going to make 3 points here. The first is that we can't fix civic education without fixing school reform more broadly. And I'll explain more what I mean. The second is that we can't fix civic education without research that gives us a better handle on changing public opinions about what ideal governance looks like. And the third is we need a kind of education across the board, but why not start with social studies educators, that provides for students positive experiences in authentic and meaningful collective projects of public work. So let me start with the first. We can't fix civic education without fixing school reform. Can I pace? Can you hear me? Okay. It's okay? It's not being recorded or anything. School reform. We know that the word of the hour is standards, right? Standardization. We have standardized testing run amok. There's now some pushback towards it, but it's still very present and in some places getting more and more. And of course, I don't have any problem with standards. Right? In fact, I don't think I've ever met a teacher who doesn't have standards. Everyone has standards, you know. And also accountability, right? Everyone's accountable. Teachers are accountable to their kids, to the parents, to the principal, to the community. So standards and accountability are not the problem. The problem is with standardization, because standardization literally means making everything the same. When we go into a classroom, we don't really want one classroom in downtown Toronto to be doing the exact same thing in the exact same way as a classroom in rural Kentucky or rural Saskatchewan. Right? That kind of standardization is homogenizing in a way that, of course, kills the passion and flourish that good teachers bring to the classroom. And in fact, it's pushed many teachers out of the classroom. So the problem's not with standards, the problem is with standardization. When I go into a McDonald's, if I'm traveling, sure, I want to know that my quarter pounder with cheese is going to taste a lot like the one I had in this other place, because that's what I'm going into McDonald's for. If I wanted a unique experience, I wouldn't go into McDonald's, right? But schools are not McDonald's. I've spoken in almost all 50 states, in all the provinces, and in places around the world, and I love asking people this question: can you tell me about your favorite teacher? And let me tell you that I have never once gotten the answer, oh yeah, you know, my favorite teacher was Miss Smith. You know why? She taught everything exactly the same way that every other teacher taught, right? No, you remember the teachers who, turned their classroom into a jungle, or took the kids when they were teaching fractions out to the construction site down the road to measure the angle of the building as it was going up, and taught geometry through that, right? Or the teacher who brought her own passions into the classroom for whatever her passion was, and linked that to the curricular material. And so we don't want things to look the same. We want teachers to be able to brim with the passion that comes with that. But more and more, the assessment juggernaut and the standardization movements have taken away even our language for talking about different school goals. This is what one teacher said to me in a study a year ago. She said, "In my 22 years of teaching, never have I experienced a climate that has turned all educational problems into problems of measurement until now. Poor citizenship skills? Raise their math and literacy scores. Poor participation? Doesn't matter. Poverty? Inequality? The solution is always, always to give the students more tests. These days, pedagogically, I feel like I can't breathe." I see like a lot of people nodding. It sounds familiar, right? And this is, of course, what's also pushing some of the best teachers out of the classroom in both the United States and Canada. One of my favorite examples about how our society is changing, because of course it's not just schools that are succumbing to this measurement, accountability sort of onslaught. It's most institutions in our society, including medicine and many others. But I love this example just because it seems to just capture it so nicely. I was reading some material about, well, how many people live in a place that has a school breakfast program? Yeah, right. These are amazing programs. They give breakfast to kids who would otherwise be hungry through a large portion of the day, and wonderful people work at this program. And I was looking at the website of the Ottawa School Breakfast Program, and I came across, and I know the people there. They serve 8,000 children breakfast every day in Ottawa, and there's wonderful people who do that. But I was reading the website and there was a Q&A, and the first question was, why is the school breakfast program important? And I'm going to read you the answer verbatim so I don't mess it up. They said this: children who arrive at school hungry do not perform well in the classroom. Numerous studies have shown that students who are fed are more alert, develop greater self-esteem, have better attendance, and fewer discipline problems. Children who receive a healthy, nutritious head start to the day show a marked improvement in academic achievement. Gosh, it wouldn't be enough to just feed the kids because they were hungry, right? No, we have to know that it's going to raise scores on standardized tests. Now, the Ottawa school breakfast people, don't believe that, but of course they know where the funding is coming from. They have to do that. But what I love about this example is like how much purer an example of just a more basic moral obligation, feeding hungry children, right, has to be twisted to this assessment framework, right, that we need to know that it raises kids' test scores. Some of you may be old enough to remember the craze about putting, I think it was like Sony Walkman at the time, attaching them to students, to mothers' stomachs, right, and playing Mozart. Because a study had shown that, was this because to expose the fetus to some of the kind of pinnacle artistic developments of Western civilization? No, it was because studies showed that, 15 years later, scores on standardized measures of academic achievement would go up, right? So mothers were walking around with these things strapped to their stomachs. By the way, also in the Ottawa Breakfast Program quote, you'll notice in the quote that it said studies show that kids, and I, as a social scientist, I can't help wondering, and I hope you are too, who are the control groups in this study? Are they starving some kids and putting them in a room over here? And then, of course the kids who are, fed do better. But it's sort of what spreads is a kind of collective insanity where there was another study out of Michigan that said that kids who chew gum while they're taking the test do better. And so then another school district, not in Michigan, but in a neighboring state, decided to mandate gum chewing during the test, right? And it's not that these things, might not work, but because, the kids are bored out of their minds, right? So chewing gum, doing jumping jacks, eating cookies, whatever it is, probably does work. But what's twisted is our whole notion of what the purpose of a public education is and what the process and the relationships involved in teaching and learning. So, yes, in fact, sometimes when I see some of these things in the US and I come back to Canada, which is suffering from all the same things now, but it always takes a few years to seep across the border. Sometimes I feel like one of those dystopian characters in a dystopian science fiction movie where I've gone to the future and then I come back from the future and say, oh my God, I've seen it, it's horrible, don't go there, it's terrible. But now it's here too, and in fact, if anything, we're seeing the opt-out movements in the US that now are also going to take, they're here too, but they're going to take a little time to take root. The tests, of course, focus only on math and literacy, not on social studies, history, science, drama, arts, and so on. And so, is there space for the arts? Well, if there's time after test prep, most teachers have had the experience of having their curriculum kind of hijacked, like a science teacher will be told to have them do a lot of writing about science because the writing test is coming up. A colleague just told me about Oakland schools that are now starting in early August, like August 5th. And the reason is because that gives them more time before the standardized testing, which comes in May, and then they let the kids out earlier, right? So we're talking about shifting the entire school schedule in the service of these tests. And we see other social examples of this too. Does anyone know what ODD stands for? Yeah, there's the psychologist in the room. Oppositional defiance disorder, right? It's a psychiatric disorder. It's been in the DSM for quite a while, but in the last DSM, it's kind of been beefed up. Oppositional defiance disorder is a disease characterized by symptoms like kids who argue with adults or defy rules or talk back a lot. I think I definitely sometimes thought my kids had this disease, but I've looked at videos, and I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, and I'm not saying that this disease does not exist. I've seen videos of kids who look pretty darn defiant, but it might be interesting to know that in this period of school reform where standardization and assessment has taken such strong hold, the incidence of diagnosis of ODD has skyrocketed. It's gone from between 1 and 3% in schools to, in some schools now in urban centers, up to 20% of children are diagnosed with ODD. And the treatments for ODD can be cognitive behavioral therapy, they can be discipline of various kind, and they can also be very strong psychotropic drugs. And children as young as, I'm not kidding, I know this is hard to believe and I was shocked myself, but as young as 3 years old are diagnosed with oppositional defiance disorder and sometimes given these drugs. And so the diagnosis rate has skyrocketed in exactly the same time when kids are told that they need to prepare for the tests and math and literacy only, and recess is cut because we don't have time for that and so forth, right? There was a teacher in Oregon, Norm Diamond, who decided he was going to coin his own disease, and he called it CAD. And that stood for Compliance Acquiescence Disorder. He said CAD was characterized by kids believing everything they're told, believing the commercial media, and staying restrained when outrage is warranted. And that was a direct dig on the latest DSM, which actually had as one of the descriptions for ODD, it said, children often become outraged even when outrage is warranted, right? And it's still diagnosable. So this is the context, right, that we're in, and why do I care so much about this kind of narrowing of the curriculum to only test prep in math and literacy and boring kids and all of that? Well, of course, because it takes away time and energy from the things we need to be doing that really matter in schools. Building relationships, teaching critical analysis of ideas, engaging with multiple perspectives, and there are a growing number of studies, empirical work that is actually showing that the narrowing of the curriculum has exactly that effect, which is reducing opportunities for critical thinking, engaging with multiple perspectives, and doing work that is linked to the world outside of schools. Remember that John Dewey's vision of the democratic school was one where children and teachers alike are members of a community where everyone participates and everyone has something to contribute, which is, of course, the most important civic lesson that we can offer children, in particular in the ideas of fake news, in the era of fake news, misinformation, and misdirection, because if children do not have a role to play in participating in what's going on, and know that their contribution helps the community, then they have no incentive or reason to think that when they're outside of school that they're going to have a role to play in their democracy. That's why Dewey's so well known for the school being a miniature community, right, reflective of the outside world. And I think it's a very powerful idea, and not well implemented in schools, that every child should know that they have something to contribute. I mean, it seems like a Hallmark card, I guess, when you first think about it, but think about it. There are kids who know by second grade that they can't do school, right? And can't do school means they can't perform in math or reading. And when they learn that, of course, they spend the rest of their school career spending most of their time trying to not get caught not knowing things, not learning the ways that they can participate, even if they're not as good as this in one area. So when we narrow the curriculum, we reduce the opportunities for children to know that they have an ability and an obligation to participate. And that is one of the fundamental principles of a democratic society, is that we all have something to contribute and have an obligation to understand what's going on around us. John Dewey said, the goal of the school must be to enable the child to translate his powers over into terms of their social equivalencies, to see what they mean in terms of what they are accomplishing in social life. Social life, he doesn't mean like making friends, he means society, right? So that the school curriculum is inextricably linked to the outside society. And that is the core of democratic education, teaching and learning that has social meaning and that connects to the life of the community. So that's why I'm particularly concerned about this narrowing of the curriculum in terms of teaching democratic citizenship. The second topic that I said is that we can't fix civic education without research that gives us a better handle on changing public opinions about what ideal governance looks like. So we can't even begin to think about misdirection or misinformation if we don't have buy-in in a broad and substantive way to the idea that this is the system we're supposed to be upholding. And we used to, for a long time, many years, take for granted that people had that idea. In fact, most of us academics sort of turn to the word democracy when we want to do an end run around specifying the exact values and ideals that we might be pushing for, because we kind of felt like, well, no one can disagree with democratic goals, right? Schools have democratic goals because we live in a democratic society. In 1958, 73% of Americans said they had faith in the federal government. In 2015, before our current president, public trust in government was just 19%, which was a historic low. In a widely circulated Pew Research report that some of you have probably seen from 2017, raised also considerable alarm. The report had this nice rosy title, which is funny because it says, globally, broad support for representative and direct democracy. But when you actually look at the data and what they report, there's the rosy title seems like it might be full of thorns. In the United States, just as one example, this is a global study, but in the United States, 22% of respondents thought that a political system in which a leader could make decisions without interference from Congress or the courts would be a good way of governing. But here's the real disturbing statistic, is that almost half of millennials thought that. Half. 48%. Globally, by the way, the earlier figure, the 22%, was 26% of respondents thought that a political system in which a leader could make decisions without interference would be a good way of governing. In another study released almost at the same time, a couple months earlier, Harvard lecturer Yascha Mounk and Australian political scientist Robert Stephen Foa looked at longitudinal data from the World Values Survey. And they found that between 1995 and 2014, the number of people who report a preference for a government leader who did not need to bother with elections has increased in almost every developed and developing democracy around the world. Again, the growth has been greatest among youth and young adults. For the Canadians in the room, Canadians born in the 1980s, only 45% of those surveyed consider democracy essential. 14% say democracy is bad or very bad. Now, part of this we can understand, because if they're interpreting democracy not as a theoretical construct, but as what they see around them, then I would also say democracy is bad, right? It's not really working for us right now. And so we need more research that delves into what people mean when they answer that way, and probably qualitative research would be better at getting at those notions. Do they mean that we're experiencing a crisis in democracy, or do they mean that the whole concept of representation and public decision making is just a bad idea, and what we need is a dictator? So, interestingly, I mean, despite the legislative setbacks of the past year, obviously we've had some horrendous things going on in the U.S. and also in Brazil and around the world in terms of wanting kind of authoritarian style leaders in charge, and many of these leaders make the U.S. president look, you know, downright peachy. But what has been amazing is the stunning sort of, so far, working at times of the checks and balances, right? So just yesterday, we had the court overrule the decision to do Alaska oil drilling in the Arctic Sea. Now, if that makes it to the Supreme Court, it'll probably be, it'll go Trump's way again. But there is this system of checks and balances that is working, which makes a teachable moment in some sense for how the system is designed, what are the flaws in it, and what are the possibilities. But despite these legislative setbacks of the past year, what I want to focus our attention on is the fact that the dismantling, that the presidency, right, so far in these 2 years, has been a kind of stunningly effective means in its core mission, which is not to pass specific legislation, but rather to dismantle the entire notion of modern democratic governance as it has evolved since the early 20th century. What many financial, power, and political interests in many countries, many democracies around the world want right now is to concentrate that power in a smaller and smaller number of people, and to do that by emphasizing the individual over the notion of the common good, so that we now, in many, for many young people, don't even have really a language to talk about the public and the common good. The third area I said I wanted to talk about was the need for a kind of education across the board, but why not start with social studies educators, that provides for students positive experiences in authentic and meaningful collective projects of public worth. And that's where I think we really need to be moving towards that. Excuse me one second. This earlier this year in October, I was in Essen, Germany, and then I was taking a train from Frankfurt to Prague. And I didn't really realize this, but as I was standing in the Frankfurt train station, it became clear to me that I was standing, first of all, it was exactly 80 years, literally within a couple of months, from Kristallnacht, right? 80 years after Kristallnacht happened. And I realized that I was standing in the very train station that my mother was standing on when she was 10 years old, and boarded a Kindertransport from Germany to Switzerland, where she lived her adolescent years in a home that became an orphanage. She was 10 years old. She was on one of the last Kindertransports to be allowed out of Germany. Only children were allowed, and that was the last time that she saw her parents. And she remembers all kinds of things from that time. She knew exactly what track it was on. Interestingly, the Frankfurt train station was not bombed during the war, and so it stands pretty much in the same way that it was then, just different advertisements. She remembers the track. She remembers her grandmother and her mother running after as the train pulled out and waving, and she remembers trying to smile, smiling at them so that they wouldn't be upset. And once on the train, she says there was a young girl across from her who was disconsolate. She gave that girl her doll to make her a little happier, and then they tried to sing songs. I was thinking about that when I was speaking on related topics, obviously because of the similarities I see in the kind of move towards a love of authoritarian and possibly totalitarian leaders. I'm not comparing this moment to Weimar Germany or comparing Trump to Hitler, but I am comparing, of course, the tendencies for people to succumb to the same rhetoric and the same strategies, whether they're conscious or unconscious, of those times in the 1930s. And when I speak, I sometimes ask people to do this thought experiment, and I think some of you have heard this, so I'm not going to repeat the whole thing here, but I asked people to think about being blindfolded and whisked up into the air and then being dropped down somewhere on the earth in a classroom and observing a lesson. But the catch to the thought experiment is that they don't know where, in what country they've landed and in what country they're watching this lesson. And then my question is, would you know if you had landed in a classroom in a democratic nation or whether you had landed in a totalitarian dictatorship or a religious theocracy or a military, a government ruled by a military junta? And I think that many of us have a sort of, quick reaction that like, well, of course we know, like our schools in the United States or Canada are nothing like the schools in North Korea or China or Iran. It's completely different. But, when you think about it, right, teaching a lesson in fractions or a lesson in balancing an equation in chemistry or the life cycle of a glowworm, I don't know, what, any of these things, right? Many of those could be very similar in many countries around the world, whether they are democratic or totalitarian. And so what it raises the question for me is, what should be different in schools in a democratic society? And there are many answers to that, but I think that three essential differences are that we need to encourage students to ask tough questions about social policy and about the world around them, because they are going to be the ones to have to participate in making social policy. We need to provide students with the information, including competing narratives, that they need to consider different perspectives. And most importantly, I think we need to convey to students that the way we live is a choice, right? We make choices about these things. They're not the air we breathe or some kind of natural rule of law, right? We make choices about how we want to live, and we enact those choices through laws. Politics has become this terribly dirty word in our culture. If I say, Chris, you're just being political, it's like he's a mudslinging candidate running for political office. But politics has a much more noble history as a word. There's a famous book by Bernard Crick called In Defense of Politics, where he says that politics is the way people in a democratic society come together to work out their differences and to move forward, right? Because you have to have compromises and you have to come to some kind of solution to moving forward. So politics was a very noble word. Right? So people often say we need to keep politics out of the school, but I think we need to bring it in for exactly that reason. Kids need to be engaged with the current controversies of the day, not the historical ones. The historical ones are way too easy. They don't teach critical thinking. Except for some lunatics, no one debates whether Hitler was a good or a bad man. So it's the current debates that inoculate kids against misinformation, misdirection, and the idea that what they have to say doesn't matter. And the knowledge that what they have to say matters should be really one of the cornerstones of a democratic education for that reason. We're also experiencing an unprecedented level of alienation and loneliness in our society, partly due to the technology, right, that abounds. Even when you walk around ARA, you see everyone either with headphones in or staring at their phone. And I saw someone trip down the escalator today, walking on their phone. There's terrific videos on YouTube about people falling into fountains and stuff, looking at their phone. And again, this is of course part of the endless distraction that is in its most basic form an anti-democratic industry, because endless distraction means we're not participating authentically in things that matter. But this idea of loneliness and alienation also feeds the notion that we can't come together to work on collective projects that are meaningful and that have impact. And of course there are strategies that work against that. But the loneliness is something I think we really need to take very seriously, and I don't think educators and social studies educators in particular recognize enough, myself included, as a key link to democratic education, because loneliness is the opposite of collective work, right? A lot of people find meaning through connections with others conducting collective work. My daughter, who is actually here tonight, wrote an op-ed for one of the University of Toronto newspapers proposing a radical change to campus life, which was that she wanted them to ban cell phones on campus, right? To address the pervasive loneliness, and it was spurred by a recent suicide that had happened on campus, that students are experiencing on university campuses around the world. But of course, it's not limited to students, right? There's adults also are reporting sort of record-breaking sense of alienation and loneliness. And although that's not, as educators, our first purview or our first responsibility, I do think that we need to make schools and classrooms places where people have meaningful relationships and authentic, and work together on authentic collective work. Some of you may know that Ontario, we have in Ontario now our own little Betsy DeVos as education minister, Lisa Thompson, and the education ministers like Secretary of Education. She's proposed things like raising class sizes. She said that that would build resilience among students, just like Betsy DeVos did some time ago. So would hitting students over the head with a 2x4 every day, that'll build resilience too. But and in Ontario, we're seeing these same trends take root here, right? But one of the ones that just was proposed is that students in Ontario would have to take 4 online courses during high school to get their degree. Okay. There's, of course, this is not based on any evidence that online courses are good or that they teach kids about technology. It's just, obviously there's a lot of money to be made, and it's also coupled with the kind of technophilic notion that anything technical or technological is good. But in a time of an epidemic of loneliness, the idea that kids will sit at home in their pajamas doing their courses from their kitchen table is very troublesome, right? And it's more troublesome for the fact that we are unable to control our bad habits of distraction and misdirection. So that many students, just like many higher education students now, will like the idea of online learning because they don't have to go to school and they can do it from home in their pajamas in their kitchens. We're not very good at caring for ourselves in that way, but we're also not very good at caring for the kinds of relationships that build the kind of social capital that strengthens democratic institutions and that pushes against the kinds of statistics that I had read about earlier. What troubles me about the similarities between now and the time that my mother boarded that train to Switzerland is that I feel that we are being duped in the same ways, and that schools are, educators have their hands tied in some ways by this emphasis on standardization, on testing, on making everything the same, and that is a giant misdirection, right? A misdirection of our efforts from many of those of us in this room to build the kinds of experiences that students need in order to believe in democratic governance again, right? To believe in the idea that we can come together and work together to build collective outcomes of good worth, like that wonderful Elizabeth Warren off-the-cuff speech about that manufacturers might make goods, but they take those goods on roads that we all build together. Those kinds of the role of government and the role of collective governance has to be emphasized not just as taught material, not that we just have to teach about democracy, but it has to be lived in the school experience. And we have a number of obstacles that push against that. The literary theorist Amanda Anderson said that she thinks that literary theory, the primary question that literary theory should be asking is, how should we live? And I kind of like that as a guiding question for what we as educators, social studies educators to be sure, but educators writ large, what we need to be having kids ask, which is, how should we live? Because the very asking of that question is a profoundly radical act. Because asking how should we live implies that we have a choice, and that they have a choice, and that the choices they make matter. Thank you very much.
Five minutes
Okay.
for a couple questions. I know it's not a lot, but
Questions, comments, tell me that I'm full of it. I was a teacher, so I'm used to wait time too, so.
Given these long-term trends that you talked about, the deterioration of democratic citizenship in the United States and its post-candidates, why are you optimistic that these trends should be reversed at this time? Do you see something, some dynamic that's out there that social studies educators haven't seen in the past?
Thanks so much for asking that. If anyone didn't hear it, it's why am I optimistic that things can change? Am I seeing any dynamics? And the answer is yes, and I see it in both kids and I see it in teachers, and I see it among parents. Let's do those in the reverse order. Among parents, parents are fed up with the narrowing of the school curriculum. And in fact, parents in wealthy districts have pushed schools to abandon certain forms of standardized testing. They're sick and tired of their kids coming home, crying when they're 7 years old because of the pressure of these tests, or because their tests determine whether their teachers will have a job. And they're pushing back. They want their kids to have the arts, to have poetry, to have collective projects of meaning, even if they don't use that terminology. And so the opt-out movement, in particular in the United States, has grown dramatically. There's many famous instances of it, like Garfield High School in the state of Washington, where the teachers came together and said that they weren't going to give the standardized tests. They were threatened with being fired. They held out. They said, we're not doing it. And eventually the district decided to abandon the tests altogether and are not doing standardized testing anymore in that district. And there's many, many examples of that. Of course, we're seeing then teachers, we're seeing tremendous empowerment among teachers in the so-called wildcat strikes in Arizona and Tennessee, and in many states in the US, where teachers are finding their collective voice. I mean, I was with Arizona teachers, there's teachers who say they voted Republican for 20 years, but they just can't swallow anymore the destruction of public education for their kids. And they're winning. Right? They're winning. In many of these states, these struggles are successful, and salaries are going up, working conditions are changing, class size is getting smaller. Now, Canadians are more polite, but we see the same protest going on here. And of course, just a couple of days ago was a massive 20,000 gathering at Queen's Park, pushing back at these same kinds of legislative policies. And then lastly, of course, kids. We see Parkland. We see kids all over the world, really. Greta, what's her name? Sorry? The environment, the autistic child who stood up, Greta Thunberg, yeah. Who basically started, a movement with other kids who were organizing to demand environmental justice. And then just a few days ago in Ontario again, there was a massive school walkout, student walkout to protest about the inattention to climate change that they see adults having, and attention to the cuts in public education, to roll back those cuts. I saw a sign that I had not seen, by the way, in Arizona or any of the other places where I was, these things, and I loved it. I couldn't believe it hasn't been used before. Maybe it has and I just didn't see it, but it was cuts to education don't heal. I thought it was so clever and so obvious, but I hadn't seen it. So yeah, so I am optimistic because there's pushback from average citizens, from parents, there's pushback from teachers who are finding a new form of collective power, even as their collective bargaining rights are being stripped. And there's pushback among children. So I'm the standard line, cautiously optimistic.
One more question, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so it's kind of a two-part thing. So some of the things you're talking about, I think, also deal with issues of equity and social justice. And some of the examples you just mentioned deal with some affluent schools, right? And one of the things that came to my mind is in the States with charter schools, right? And the huge proliferation of charter schools. I'm from North Carolina, where charter schools are completely deregulated. Yeah. They're everywhere. They're just all over the place. What are your thoughts related to how this kind of work you're talking about relates to this kind of development of charter schools? And then is there anything comparable in Canada? Because I'm not familiar with that.
So charter schools so far in Canada are in one private, not charter schools, but sort of for private, no, they are charter schools, yeah, are in Alberta. But there are initiatives to do it in many other provinces now, so it's coming here, or at least a push for it. I don't think it'll be as easy to do here. There's much greater public support for public institutions. There's much greater confidence in public institutions. But those forces are definitely at work here. And in fact, the Koch brothers donate tens of millions of dollars to an institute called the Fraser Institute, which is a right-wing think tank that pushes the notion of privatization in charter schools and many other things, and standardization and standardized tests. So that was the answer to the Canada question. I do think that's an incredibly difficult obstacle, not just charter schools, but of course the privatization and corporatization of schools overall. It creates a context where it becomes, again, difficult to have a language. When the marketplace, Sean Wilentz said that we used to have a market economy and now we have a market society, meaning that everything is measured in the terms of market forces, and I think the way to push back on that, obviously in the short term we need to engage with political struggles to stop it as best we can, and I think we should hopefully engage teachers in those struggles as well. But in the longer term, or the slower term, or the more subtle, I think that what I said earlier about teaching kids that these are choices, right? Because right now the market is like the air we breathe. Like kids in North America don't have any language to talk about some other system, and thinking about different ways, teaching kids not just about different systems, but simply that there are different systems, right? And that we can learn from different things. There's pros and cons to different economic arrangements. There's pros and cons to different political arrangements. And there's choices to be made. Again, I think that's the idea that there are choices or that there are multiple perspectives are very radical acts. My kids went to school. My daughter was 4 when we moved here, and I don't know how. For all of you, how much did you learn about the War of 1812? I think I had like a half a sentence of it in my textbook or something, in 9th grade or something. I don't know. We moved here, and my kids went to school in Canada, and they spend like 2 months on the War of 1812, right? Canadians and Americans can't even agree on who won the War of 1812. And those kinds of multiple perspectives are right in front of us. They're so accessible. I mean, you can pull up a textbook from the US or from England or from any English-speaking country and compare it to the textbook that you're using in the class. You can pull up a textbook from Russia and translate it using Google Translate and compare it. And of course that gives this sense that that there are options and that there are choices out there. And I think that that's what we as educators can offer in the longer term project. Again, in the short term, I think we have political struggle. We have to organize, we have to push back.